Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. I'm your host, Bob Boudelier. This podcast, my website, my newsletter, and my community are focused on helping you discover the secrets of innovation in the age of AI. Since I don't rely on paid ads, I want to thank our customers who bring me onto their programs on a fractional basis for 10 to 12 weeks as a technical product accelerator to work alongside their teams, helping them develop medical products smarter and faster without adding risk, while bringing human-centered AI skills into their organizations. You can learn more at www.innoguide.net. In this episode, number 89, we'll be sharing Part 1 of Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein. I'm excited about this book because with the advent of AI tools, we now have the power to go very deep in a particular topic. But what David Epstein shows us is that generalists wielding these tools have incredible power, and without these tools, specifically without having the range that a generalist has in their domain, they are at a disadvantage when it comes to ensuring system-level challenges have been addressed when building products or considering solutions for many different types of challenges. So without further ado, let's get started. Introduction. Here are two stories that reveal something fascinating about how excellence develops. Stories that seem to contradict everything we've been told about success. First story you may know well. A boy balanced on his father's palm at 6 months old, had a putter in his hands by 7 months, and was on national TV by age 2 driving a golf ball past Bob Hope. His father, a former Green Beret and sociology major, had a vision. He taught his toddler psychological tactics for handling media, mapped out his destiny with surgical precision, and by the time his son reached Stanford, he was proclaiming him the chosen one, someone with greater impact than Gandhi, Buddha, and Nelson Mandela combined. This boy engaged in deliberate practice in quotes from the earliest age, accumulating specialized training hours that embodied what we now call the 10,000 hours rule. The second story is equally remarkable, though quieter. A boy played squash, skiing, wrestling, swimming, skateboarding, basketball, handball, tennis, table tennis, badminton, and soccer. His mother was a tennis coach, but deliberately didn't teach him, saying he'd upset her with his unconventional strokes. His parents had no plan A and no plan B. They were, as one observer noted, pulley rather than pushy. He didn't specialize in tennis until his teens, long after other competitors had hired strength coaches and sports psychologists. Yet in his mid-30s, at an age when most legendary players retired, he was still ranked number 1 in the world. These boys, Tiger Woods and Roger Federer, met in 2006 at the apex of their powers. Federer beat Woods in the U.S. Open final and later reflected, "His story is completely different from mine. Even as a kid, his goal was to break records. I was just dreaming of meeting Boris Becker." Here's what fascinates me. We built an entire industry around the Tiger Woods model. Best-selling books, parenting manuals, and cultural icons all celebrate hyper-specialization and early starts. Yet when scientists examine the complete development paths of elite athletes, not just champions at their peak, but from early childhood, they discover something unexpected. Eventual elites typically spend less time on deliberate practice early on. Instead, they undergo what researchers call a sampling period, playing various sports in unstructured environments, developing physical proficiencies across domains, and only later intensifying focus. Studies across soccer, hockey, and volleyball confirm this pattern. German scientists studying their World Cup winning team found members were typically late specializers. 2-year soccer studies showed kids playing multiple sports improved more by age 13 than those in intensive organized training. Yet the marketing machine promoting hyper-specialization is so successful and pervasive that Roger's path remains quietly told. When I began researching specialization beyond sports, I discovered something compelling. The conventional wisdom just doesn't hold up. Studies showed that while early career specializers enjoyed an initial earnings advantage after college, late specializers eventually caught up by finding work that matched their skills and personalities. Technological inventors and artistic creators both demonstrated that accumulating diverse experiences actually increased creative impact compared to those who drilled deeply in a single area. I became fascinated by remarkable figures from Duke Ellington, who prioritized drawing and baseball over formal music training, to Mariam Mirzakhani, who dreamed of being a novelist before becoming the first woman to win the Fields Medal in mathematics. These weren't people who succeeded despite their range, they succeeded because of it. And here's what really struck me. When I spoke to a small group of Pat Tillman Foundation scholars, military veterans pursuing career changes in further education, their response was startling. These former paratroopers and translators becoming teachers, scientists, and engineers felt ashamed about their nonlinear paths, viewing their diverse experiences as liabilities rather than assets. A Navy SEAL with degrees in history and geophysics, now pursuing graduate work in business and public administration, felt somehow behind despite their extraordinary background. That reaction prompted me to dive deeper into research. I found that highly credentialed experts can become dangerously narrow-minded, growing more confident even as they deteriorate. I discovered that effective learning is deliberately slow and looks inefficient, like falling behind. Surprisingly, a 50-year-old tech founder is nearly twice as likely to launch a blockbuster company as a 30-year-old. Yet, Silicon Valley and youth sports industries promote early specialization relentlessly. Overspecialization threatens entire systems. The 2008 financial crisis revealed how segregated banking departments optimize for their own purposes while creating catastrophic outcomes. Mortgage specialists lowered payments while foreclosure specialists seize homes. Healthcare faces similar problems when interventional cardiologists reflectively use stents despite evidence of inappropriateness. An internationally renowned scientist described innovation as suffering from parallel trenches. Specialists so deep in their own work they never notice solutions visible in adjacent fields. These realizations fundamentally change how I understand my own nonlinear path from science to crime reporting to sports writing to this book. The challenge we face is maintaining breadth's benefits in a world increasingly demanding hyperspecialization. While certain fields require Tiger Woods-like precocity, our interconnected complexity increasingly demands Rogers, people embracing diverse experiences and perspectives as they progress. That's what this book explores. 1. The Cult of the Head Start. Let me start by telling you about one of the most fascinating experiments in human potential you'll ever hear. It's a story that changed how we think about genius, expertise, and whether extraordinary achievement is something you're born with or something you can manufacture. After World War II devastated his family, a Hungarian man named Laszlo Polgar became obsessed with an audacious idea. He could create genius intentionally. He spent years studying history's greatest thinkers, and he concluded that traditional education was fundamentally broken. Schools, he believed, produced only what he called the gray average mass. So he decided he needed something radical, a wife willing to partner in his grand experiment. He found that partner in Clara, a fellow teacher who shared his vision completely. After a year and a half of correspondence, he proposed by letter. They married, moved to Budapest, and in 1969, when their first daughter Susan was born, the Polgar experiment officially began. Now, Laszlo needed to choose his training ground carefully. He selected chess, partly because the Fischer-Spassky match in 1972 was making chess culturally relevant, but mostly because, as Clara put it, chess is very objective and easy to measure. He started Susan with pawn wars, then advanced to endgames and opening traps. By age 4, she was undefeated. By 6, she was years ahead academically. When Hungarian authorities pushed back against homeschooling, Laszlo fought them tooth and nail so Susan could dedicate herself fully to chess. The training was meticulous and all-consuming. The girls trained at the gym at 7 in the morning, then spent their entire day studying chess. When Laszlo exhausted his own expertise, he hired coaches. He personally cut 200,000 chess game records, creating what was likely the world's largest private chess database outside Soviet archives. And the results? Absolutely stunning. Susan became the first woman to qualify for the Men's World Championship. When all three sisters competed in the 1988 Chess Olympiad at ages 14, 12, and 10, they won and broke the Soviet Union's 12-year dominance. Susan achieved Grandmaster status in 1991, and Judith, at 15 years and 5 months, became the youngest Grandmaster ever. This success story entered popular culture as proof positive that early specialization and deliberate practice could unlock genius in virtually any domain. Books celebrated the Polgars as evidence that head starts guarantee success in everything that matters. But here's the question nobody asked. Does the Polgar model actually work everywhere or only in domains like chess? The answer became visible when machines become tactically superior to humans. When machines became tactically superior to humans, Kasparov faced a fascinating question. What if human thinking partnered with machine calculation? He organized the first advanced chess tournament, and the results were eye-opening. A month after crushing an opponent 4 games to nothing, Kasparov drew with that same player when computers were in the mix. His decades of tactical pattern memorization, the very foundation of his genius, had been made irrelevant. Freestyle chess took this even further. Teams of amateurs with 3 ordinary computers demolished Hydra, the world's best supercomputer, and beat grandmaster teams too. The winners weren't chess savants. They were people skilled at directing multiple machines and synthesizing information for strategy. In fact, when an amateur engineer named Anson Williams won a major freestyle tournament, he wasn't even playing traditional chess. He was managing tactical advisors, deciding whose recommendations to pursue. His background in real-time strategy video games mattered more than his chess rating. But here's the crucial insight. When humans outsourced the most easily replaceable part of expertise, pattern recognition, they suddenly competed at the highest levels ever seen. The part that took years to master had become irrelevant. This reveals what actually makes experts appear superhuman. When researcher Adrienne de Groot flashed chessboards at players of varying abilities, grandmasters seemed to have photographic memories. But when the researchers added random piece placements, those same grandmasters performed like novices. There was no magic. Through repetitive pattern study, experts had learned to group information into meaningful chunks, 5 patterns instead of 28 pieces. This chunking requires extensive repetitive practice in constrained domains. It's why specialized training begun after age 12 dropped the chances of reaching international master from 1 in 4 to 1 in 55. But here's where everything gets complicated. When you take this hyper-specialized approach, this cult of the head start, and apply it beyond chess and golf, something troubling happens. Most human domains aren't like chess. They're unpredictable. They're what researchers call unkind environments, where familiar patterns mislead you and the rules change without warning. In these wicked worlds, narrow specialization doesn't just fail to help, it actually backfires. Chris Argyris studied high-powered consultants from elite business schools for 15 years. They excelled at well-defined problems, but relied on finding the first familiar solution. When wrong, they got defensive rather than adapting. That's not the flexibility you want from people whose job it is teaching others to change. In emergency rooms, what researcher Robin Hogarth calls Martian tennis, you're watching a game happen, but nobody's explained the rules, and they change without warning. When bridge experts faced altered rules or accountants encountered new tax laws, they performed worse than novices. Narrow specialization has made them brittle. The real evidence points somewhere else entirely. Nobel laureates are 22 times more likely than other scientists to have artistic hobbies. They're musicians, painters, mechanics, writers. These weren't distractions. They were strength building. Steve Jobs credited a calligraphy course with the Max typography. Claude Shannon merged philosophy and logic with engineering to birth the information age. The pattern is unmistakable. In our wicked world of ill-defined challenges, the antidote to cognitive entrenchment isn't earlier specialization. It's range. It's keeping one foot outside of your world. It's traveling an 8-lane highway early on rather than a one-way street. The Polgar story is extraordinary and true, but it's not a universal template. It's a cautionary tale wrapped in a success story, a reminder that how we build genius matters enormously, and that the blueprint for excellence depends entirely on the world you're trying to master. 2. How the wicked world was made. Let me walk you through how we discovered that human cognition has fundamentally transformed across the modern world. It all started with James Flynn, political studies professor in Dunedin, New Zealand, who noticed something extraordinary in 1981. He was examining old data comparing IQ test scores of American soldiers from World Wars I and II and discovered that World War II soldiers had performed dramatically better. This sparked a question. Had civilians experienced similar improvements? When he began collecting IQ test data from other countries, the pattern was undeniable. Every single one showed massive gains across generations, about 3 points every 10 years. By today's standards, someone scoring average now would rank in the 98th percentile compared to people a century ago. What fascinated me most was about the peculiar nature of these gains. They weren't happening uniformly on subjects involving learned material, vocabulary, arithmetic, general knowledge. Scores barely moved, but on abstract reasoning tasks like Raven's progressive matrices, performance skyrocketed. When asked how dusk and dawn were alike, modern children instinctively recognize both as times separating day from night, whereas their grandparents would simply have noted they were times of the day. The mystery deepened when Alexander Luria conducted groundbreaking research in Soviet Central Asia during the 1930s. He observed villages undergoing rapid modernization, a shifting from subsistence farming to collective agriculture, introducing literacy and formal education. Comparing these modernizing villagers to remote, unchanged communities revealed something profound. The pre-modern villagers couldn't sort wool by color categories, couldn't recognize that different geometric shapes belonged together. They reasoned entirely through concrete daily experience. The modernizing farmers, however, could engage in education, extracting guiding principles from unfamiliar materials without prior instruction. Len captured this phenomena with one phrase: "We now see the world through scientific spectacles. We've learned to classify reality through abstract concept layers, thinking of animals as mammals, understanding relationships through classification schemes." But here's where it gets interesting. Modern work demands we think in layers of abstraction constantly. Computer programmers, lawyers, and countless others rely on flexible conceptual schemes to connect knowledge across domains. Yet research across our universities reveals a troubling gap. Flynn's study comparing university seniors' GPAs to critical thinking test scores found no correlation. Students couldn't apply fundamental concepts from economics, sciences, and logic to real-world scenarios. Biology majors struggled outside their fields. Psych majors didn't understand social science methods. Business majors performed poorly in economics. We've equipped students with scientific spectacles, but not a scientific reasoning Swiss Army knife. Some departments are responding. University of Washington's Calling Bullshit class filled registration in 1 minute. Computer scientist Jeanette Wing advocates computational thinking, abstraction and decomposition as fundamental as reading. Yet most students receive vocational training for jobs they'll never have. 3/4 of graduates work unrelated to their major. The solution isn't adding more electives. Students must learn how to think before learning what to think about. Consider Fermi problems, like estimating piano tuners in New York City doesn't require perfect data. You start with the city population, estimate how many households might have pianos, figure out the tuning frequency, calculate how long each tuning takes, and work backwards. The real magic isn't pinpoint accuracy, it's the systematic breakdown itself. I wasn't born understanding this. I grew up already wearing the right conceptual spectacles. But I needed formal training to capitalize on it. The key insight is that Fermi thinking is essentially a similarities problem, using what you know to investigate what you don't. Research backs this up. Training in broad thinking strategies transfers powerfully across domains, which is why it was central to the Calling Bullshit course. There, we used a deceptive cable news report to show how Fermi estimation cuts through nonsense like a hot knife through butter. That's genuinely useful. This connects to something fundamental about how humans actually learn. Pre-modern villagers, chess masters, and firefighters all shared something. They relied on tomorrow resembling yesterday. They were exceptionally prepared for the repeated situations, but completely lost when facing something novel. They learned from direct experience brilliantly, but couldn't learn without it. And that's precisely what our wicked, rapidly changing world demands we move beyond. Everything repetitive and constrained is being automated anyway. The real rewards go to people who take conceptual knowledge from one problem or domain and apply it entirely elsewhere. This ability comes from broad training, not narrow specialization. There's a particular group of performers from another era who perfected this approach. Their story is older than chess prodigies, yet it's the better parable for our modern age. 3. When less of the same is more. I want to take you to 17th century Venice and introduce you to a group of women who were, in many ways, Europe's first international rock stars. Their story begins in heartbreak, but it ends in something truly remarkable, a lesson about how we learn that challenges everything we think we know about raising talented children. The Figli du Caro, the Daughters of the Choir, emerged from the Ospedale della Pietà, a charitable institution in Venice. These were orphanages where children were left in a drawer built into an outer wall. Most of these girls were born to mothers who contracted syphilis, and they never knew their families. They were named after their home, Anna Maria della Pietà, Adelaide della Pietà. Life was rigid. Quasi-monastic rules, daily mass, constant work, just one chaperone trip to the countryside each year. But here's what's crucial. They also received education. When instruments began filling the ospedali, especially after a devastating 1630 plague that made Venetians deeply pious and eager for church music, music became part of their lives. The governors noticed something remarkable. The girls drew donations. They drew tourists willing to pay for seats, so they invested in them. Now you might think their training was relentless and grinding. It wasn't. Just 3 lessons weekly, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. What was extraordinary wasn't the intensity, it was the breadth. Unlike anywhere else in Europe, where instruments were strictly gender segregated, these girls learned every instrument their institution owned. Violin, oboe, flute, cello, bassoon, harpsichord, French horn, double bass. They switched between instruments during performance. When composer Charles Burney visited from Oxford, he witnessed female violins, tenors, basses, harpsichords, French horns, and even double basses, and noted these young persons frequently changed instruments. One woman named Magdalena performed across Europe as a violinist, harpsichordist, cellist, and soprano. Another, Pellegrina, worked as a nurse while mastering multiple instruments. And when her teeth fell out in her 60s, she simply switched from oboe to violin. Vivaldi wrote 140 concertos exclusively for these musicians. Their versatility became legendary. They performed in all styles of music, sacred or profane, creating combinations that astonished everyone from emperors to philosophers like Rousseau. These abandoned girls essentially laid the foundation for the modern orchestra itself. Yet their stories nearly vanished. Napoleon's troops threw their manuscripts out windows. A famous painting of them went unidentified for 2 centuries. They were forgotten partly because they defied papal authority, partly because they had no families to preserve their memory. Now, fast forward to today, we do the opposite. The tiger mother philosophy insists children choose one instrument early and focus exclusively. Parents agonize over instrument selection, fearing their child will fall behind. But here's what the research actually shows. The most accomplished young musicians didn't practice more than novices early on. They practiced more intensely after choosing an instrument they genuinely wanted to focus on. A study of 1,200 musicians found most who quit reported a mismatch between their assigned and desired instruments. Even Amy Chua's own daughter, Lulu, quit violin at 13, saying, "You picked it, not me." A British boarding school study found something striking. Exceptional students had distributed their effort across 3 instruments, while average students clung to their first. Breadth before depth. Exploration before specialization. This sampling period appears integral to developing world-class performers. Consider Jack Ciccini. He stumbled onto guitar at 13, experimenting nightly in Chicago clubs, eventually achieving mastery in both jazz and classical music. The Chicago Tribune recognized him as one of the rare few who possessed the patience to master classical guitar, and he was 98% self-taught. Look at Duke Ellington. His formal lesson at 7 with Marietta Clinkscale lasted barely long enough to avoid learning to read notes. He quit entirely. 7 years passed before he heard ragtime, sat at a piano, and figured it out for himself. He said, "There was no connection between me and music until I started fiddling with it myself." Yet he became America's preeminent composer. Johnny Smith grew up in a shotgun house in Alabama, experimenting with whatever instruments neighbors left behind. He had no formal training. He simply had to experiment. When the Army assigned him to teach himself multiple instruments, that constraint transformed into advantage. He eventually became NBC's musical arranger. And then there's Django Reinhardt. Born in a Romani caravan, illiterate in both words and music, he taught himself banjo guitar by ear, wandering Paris streets, busking and improvising. A wagon fire burned half his body, leaving the pinky and ring fingers of his fret hand useless. Rather than surrender, he invented a new technique, sprinting up and down the neck with his thumb and two fingers. He revolutionized guitar soloing and influenced everyone from Hendrix to Prince. Duke University's Paul Berliner found that improvisational musicians developed through osmosis, not formal instruction. Brain imaging confirms this. When jazz musicians improvise, areas associated with self-censoring actually turn off. They learn like babies. Imitate first, acquire grammar later. The great pianist Leon Fleischer, despite a lifetime of masterful training, confessed his greatest wish was simply to improvise, something he couldn't do at all. The Suzuki method was actually designed to mirror natural language acquisition. Children don't practice exercises to learn language. They master speech first, reading second. The same principle should apply to music. Research reveals something profound. Breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. When you learn something across multiple contexts, you build abstract models rather than relying on specific examples. This flexibility is what allows you to apply knowledge to unfamiliar situations, which is creativity itself. The implications are striking. Creative children typically come from homes with just one rule on average, compared to 6 in typical households. Parents of creative kids didn't prohibit things beforehand, they simply shared their opinions afterwards. Sometimes the shortest path to mastery isn't actually the most efficient route to creativity. Sometimes less of the same is more. 4. Learning fast and slow. I want to talk with you about something I've been observing for years in classrooms across America and around the world. Something that reveals a fundamental tension in how we teach, how we learn, and how we measure success. Picture an 8th grade math class. A charismatic teacher frames algebraic concepts through Eagles games, hot dogs, stadium economics. Students seem engaged, but watch closely what's actually happening. When the teacher poses a real conceptual problem, something that requires genuine understanding, students don't struggle through it. Instead, they turn it into a guessing game. Is it n over 3? No. N minus 6? Yes. They've transformed a conceptual challenge into multiple choice, and the teacher mistakes this procedural guessing for real learning. I've seen the same pattern in hundreds of classrooms filmed across the United States, Asia, and Europe. In American classrooms, about 1/5 of questions started as genuine conceptual problems. By the time students finished soliciting hints, 0% remained truly conceptual. In higher-performing countries like Japan, roughly half of all questions stayed conceptual throughout. Japanese teachers tracked the entire class's intellectual journey on massive chalkboards, creating what they called bansho, a visual record that honored dead ends and connections alike. The consequences are real. Community college students, 41% of American undergraduates, show stunning reliance on memorized algorithms. Asked whether dividing something by 5 or by 8 yields larger pieces, only 15% approached it conceptually. The others applied rules mechanically without understanding why. But here's the deeper problem. Fast and easy learning is precisely what undermines durable, flexible understanding. When we offer quick procedural solutions instead of genuine confusion, we sacrifice lasting mastery for immediate performance gains. This brings me to 2 remarkable rhesus macaques named Oberon and Macduff. In a brilliant experiment, researchers gave them random picture lists to memorize. The key variable was hints during practice. Some sessions gave automatic hints on every trial. Others let them request hints whenever they were stuck. Some allowed hints on half of their attempts, some gave no hints at all. Here's what happened. The monkeys requested hints constantly when available and performed beautifully during early practice. But on test day, when the training wheels came off, it was catastrophic. Oberon got only a third of the hint-laden lists correct. McDuff got less than 1 in 5. The exception? Lists they'd learned with 0 hints. Those took forever initially, but they improved steadily. On test day, Oberon nailed nearly 3/4 of them, and McDuff got about half. The lesson was stark. More hints during training meant better short-term performance and worse long-term retention. This connects to what researchers call desirable difficulties. Struggle itself is useful. Testing yourself, especially struggling to retrieve information before you've fully studied, primes your brain for subsequent learning, even when you get answers wrong. Most classrooms concentrate one topic intensely for a week, then move on forever. Research recommends the opposite: spacing or distributed practice. One study separated Spanish vocabulary learners, tested the same day versus tested a month later. 8 years later, with 0 studying in between, the spaced group retained 250% more vocabulary. Air Force Academy data proves this convincingly. Economists tracked 10,000 cadets randomly assigned to calculus sections. Professors whose instruction most boosted Calculus 1 performance, who earned stellar student evaluations, actually harmed their students' subsequent performance in advanced math. Those who created struggle in Calculus 1, receiving harsh evaluations, produced students who thrived later. Students were essentially punishing their best long-term teachers in the evaluations that they were given. Students also need to learn flexibility, not just procedures, but concepts they can apply in entirely new situations. This requires interleaving or mixed practice. Rather than practicing the same problem type repeatedly, you encounter different problem types shuffled together. Think about preparing to identify painters at a museum. You could study Cézanne flashcards, then Picasso, then Renoir separately. But you'd learn far better shuffling them together. Yes, you'll struggle more during practice and feel less confident, but you'll perform far better identifying unfamiliar paintings on museum day. The evidence is striking across domains, from butterfly identification to psychology to naval defense systems. College students who learn math problems mixed up perform better on tests than those who studied identical problems in blocks. Yet, here's the troubling part: 80% of students felt they'd learned better with block practice, when 80% actually performed better with mixed practice. The feeling of learning is based on visible progress, but deep learning feels slower and more effortful. Interleaving teaches you to evaluate what type of problem you're facing before matching a strategy to it. That's the hallmark of expert problem solving. And here's the critical insight. Desirable difficulties, testing, spacing, interleaving, making connections, all slow down learning and hurt short-term performance. We reflectively judge progress by how we're doing right now, and we're usually wrong about what actually matters. Our educational standards have risen substantially. Jobs now demand problem solving, not procedure application. But our teaching hasn't caught up. We're still optimizing for the wrong thing, immediate performance instead of lasting, flexible understanding. The question we face isn't whether we can teach more material faster. It's whether we're willing to embrace the discomfort that genuine learning requires, and whether we'll trust that struggle now builds better mastery later. 5. Thinking outside experience. When you're facing a problem nobody's ever solved before, your experience becomes almost worthless. It's not a pessimistic observation. It's actually liberating. It's the starting point for one of the most powerful tools your mind possesses, analogical thinking. Let me take you back to the 17th century, to Johannes Kepler. Imagine the world he inhabited. For 2,000 years, everyone had accepted the same cosmic truth. Planets orbited a stationary Earth on crystalline spheres, pushed along by planetary spirits. It was settled, it was certain, and it was completely wrong. When Kepler saw a supernova appear in the sky and watched a comet streak across the heavens, he had an unsettling realization. Those objects should have shattered the crystalline spheres if they actually existed. Something fundamental was broken. But here's the challenge he faced. Nobody had ever asked the questions he needed to answer. Why do distant planets move more slowly than closer ones? There was no empirical data. There was no existing experience to draw from. So Kepler did something remarkable. He became what I'd call an analogy addict. When faced with genuine novelty, he didn't retreat into what he knew. Instead, he deployed metaphor after metaphor, odor dispersing from its source, heat radiating through space, light emanating from the sun, planets swept along in a solar whirlpool, even captains steering their ships. Each analogy revealed new problems and generated new questions. Could the sun's power be blocked, like light? No planets moved during eclipses. Were planets magnets? Maybe, but that didn't explain everything. Should each planet have eyes to see where it's going? Kepler grew frustrated with that notion and pushed deeper. He interrogated each analogy relentlessly, pushing past their limitations until something revolutionary emerged. Celestial bodies pull one another through invisible forces acting across space. He recognized that the moon influences Earth's tides, an insight even Galileo dismissed as absurd. Kepler's journey took him from crystalline spheres and planetary souls to discovering the very laws of planetary motion. He essentially invented astrophysics by thinking far outside the boundaries of accepted experience. Northwestern psychologist Deidre Gentner has spent her career studying how this works. She is the world's foremost authority on analogical thinking, and she emphasizes what Kepler understood instinctively. When you recognize deep conceptual similarities across seemingly unrelated domains, you unlock solutions to problems that direct experience can't touch. This relational reasoning becomes essential when you're genuinely breaking new ground. But here's what's fascinating and troubling. When researchers present people with a single powerful analogy from a different domain, the proportion of successful problem solvers triples. Two analogies from disparate fields boost results even further. Yet most people don't spontaneously make these connections, even in laboratory settings designed to encourage exactly that behavior. The problem runs deeper. We're victims of what psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls the inside view. We judge situations based narrowly on the details directly in front of us, ignoring how similar problems played out elsewhere. Kahneman experienced this personally when his curriculum team estimated 2 years of additional work. Then a colleague, Seymour, asked a devastating question. How many similar teams had finished? The answer? 40% never finished this task at all. And none finished in less than 7 years. They ignored this wisdom anyway, and then it took 8 years to complete the work. The antidote is the outside view, finding structurally similar problems elsewhere and examining how they played out. A Scottish tram team project was projected to cost £320 million using the meticulous internal analysis. Consultants using structural analogies to similar projects across the world concluded this was wildly optimistic. The final cost, £1 billion. Even predicting movie box office revenues shows this pattern. Analogies to 40 older films outperformed mathematical models containing data from 1,700 films. But the crucial part, a single best analogy performed poorly. You need multiple analogies with deep structural similarity, but surface differences. The reference class itself matters profoundly. The remarkable finding is that this capacity for distant analogical thinking is learnable. When Boston Consulting Group built an intranet filled with cross-disciplinary exhibits, everything from 11th century military strategy to Sherlock Holmes methods to William the Conqueror's merger of nations, consultants suddenly could access ideas from centuries and disciplines away. The remoteness was precisely the point. When Deidre Gentner tested whether students could develop this skill, she used the ambiguous sorting task. 25 cards describing real phenomena that could be sorted by domain or by deep structure. Economic bubbles and melting ice caps are both positive feedback loops. But which students spontaneously identified these structural similarities? The ones who'd studied across multiple disciplines. They'd learned to spot the architecture beneath the surface. Kevin Dunbar's research on molecular biology labs confirms this pattern. When unexpected findings emerge, the teams with the members from diverse backgrounds, chemistry, physics, biology, genetics, immediately made analogies that solved problems. Specialized labs spent weeks experimenting before getting the same answer. The lab that never made discoveries, everyone had identical, highly specialized backgrounds and almost never used analogies. Here's the uncomfortable truth. broad interdisciplinary education requires sacrificing early specialization. All our incentives push toward narrow focus, yet the most important skill, matching yourself to the right challenge, develops slowly across varied domains. Kepler himself spent 5 years on his Mars assignment. When his calculations differed from observation by just 8 minutes of arc, a sliver of sky 1/8 the width of your finger, he discarded everything and started fresh. That 8-minute discrepancy became his keyhole into reimagining the universe. The lesson is clear here. When you're thinking outside experience, you're not disadvantaged. You're positioned exactly where genuine innovation happens. 6. The trouble with too much grit. You know the story of Vincent van Gogh, or at least you think you do. The tortured artist, driven by relentless passion, persisting through rejection and failure until he finally achieved recognition. It's the ultimate grit narrative. But here's the thing. That story gets it almost completely backward. Let me take you back to his childhood in the Netherlands. Young Vincent showed absolutely no promise in art. When he tried to sketch the family cat and realized he was terrible at it, he destroyed the drawing and refused to try again. Instead, he spent his days doing something entirely different, wandering alone for hours through storms, sitting by bird nests, collecting beetles, and meticulously labeling them with Latin names. This wasn't idle daydreaming. This was the development of extraordinary observational skills that would later become essential to his work. His teenage years reveal something equally surprising. Van Gogh attended an innovative school with a celebrated art teacher, so effective that the government actually mandated his freehand drawing method nationwide. Yet, this pioneering instructor made zero impression on the boy. Here's where the real story begins, though. Over the next 15 years, Vincent displayed absolutely remarkable grit. He tried being an art dealer, then a teacher working 14-hour days, then a pastor, and finally a missionary in the coal mines. By 27, he was despondent. A full decade of determined effort across multiple careers had yielded nothing but catastrophic defeats. He described himself as a caged bird banging its head against the bars. But then something remarkable happened. Almost as a last resort, he turned to drawing, the one thing he'd explicitly rejected as a child. He started from absolute scratch with basic instructional books. At 32, he enrolled in art school, but this time was different. Vincent abandoned his obsessive pursuit of perfect realism and technical mastery. When he painted outdoors in a storm, the speed and visceral nature of the experience freed him. He spent his remaining years in perpetual experimentation, embracing failure as part of his creative process. Here's what economists call match quality, how well your work aligns with who you actually are. Van Gogh's story isn't about a man who finally found success through grit. It's about a man who tested multiple options with intense focus, extracted rapid feedback, learned what didn't work, and moved on until he found genuine alignment. His score on the modern grit scale? The 40th percentile, not particularly high at all. Consider Gauguin, who didn't become a full-time artist until 35 after working as a stockbroker, or J.K. Rowling, who failed on an epic scale in her 20s before welfare freed her to pursue writing. Their late starts weren't obstacles, they were integral to their success. They had time to test themselves against reality. Offer Malamed studied education systems and found something fascinating. English and Welsh students had to specialize early, applying to narrow programs. But Scottish students were required to sample different fields for the first 2 years. The Scots who'd explored broadly quickly caught up in income and were significantly happier in their careers. The early specializers were making costly mistakes because they'd committed too soon. This is where grit becomes complicated. Yes, psychologist Angela Duckworth's research showed that grit predicted which West Point cadets completed Beast Barracks. The findings became wildly popular, but here's the statistical problem. West Point pre-selected already elite candidates, making other variables appear disproportionately important. More importantly, the real question Duckworth's research didn't ask, what if dropping out is actually the right decision? The data tells us something revealing. In her original study, only 71 of 1,218 plebs dropped out. By 2016, just 32 of 1,308 left. The vast majority finished regardless of grit scores. Those who leave often do so for legitimate reasons. They realize the academy doesn't match their abilities, or they were pressured into attending without genuine desire. These weren't failures of persistence. These were students responding to match quality information they couldn't have obtained without trying. Here's the elegant insight. Career matching works like a multi-armed bandit problem. You're essentially testing different options, trying to figure out which gives the best payoff. Young people trying risky paths, professional athletics, military academies, startups, isn't foolish. It's ideal. They should test high-risk, high-reward options with strong feedback mechanisms. If it's not a match, they learn quickly and move on. Seth Godin made this case brilliantly. Winners quit fast and often when they detect poor fit. The trick isn't indiscriminate quitting. Perseverance through difficulty is absolutely competitive. Rather, you should identify your conditions before quitting before you start. Here's what shocked the Army. Roughly half of West Point graduates leave active duty after their 5-year commitment, the moment they're allowed to. 3/4 are gone before 20 years. This wasn't a grit problem. As talented officers developed sophisticated skills, they'd realize they had abundant career options. They weren't quitting from weakness. They were making match-quality decisions. The Army threw $500 million at retention bonuses. Waste. But then they learned. Introduced the Officer Career Satisfaction Program, letting officers choose their branch and post in exchange for 3 additional years. 4,000 cadets accepted. Match quality, not money, drives retention. So let me tell you about myself. I scored poorly on my own grit scale because my interests genuinely shift from year to year. At 17, I was absolutely certain I'd attend the Air Force Academy to become a pilot and an astronaut. Then I changed course entirely, studied political science, switched to earth and environmental sciences with an astronomy minor, worked in labs, transitioned to journalism. I don't think I lost passion or resilience. I found better match quality. The real challenge isn't persistence. It's finding the right goal initially. We've been sold on the importance of grit, but what we actually need is courage to quit, to test, to change direction when we learn something new about ourselves. Vincent van Gogh understood this. His genius came not from slavish persistence toward a predetermined goal, but from testing options with maniacal intensity, extracting maximum information quickly, then moving on and zigzagging toward his unique genius. That's the real secret to a life well lived. So we reach the end of part 1 of Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein. I really enjoyed this book because he presents so many perspectives on how important generalists and systems thinkers are, which gave me a deep understanding of how folks like me help others leverage the deep content that comes out of large language models. My key insight here is that people who have this architectural level, system level, generalist level view will be the ones who are key to leveraging what comes out of the deep thinkers in society as well. I strongly recommend picking up a copy because Epstein has many examples that will resonate with readers from most any walk of life. Remember, our website is www.innoguide.net, where we have many resources for innovators, including those who want to get timelines slip under control in their medical product development process, those who want to leverage AI in their development process, and we also can help those who want to build medical products that will support embedded machine learning now or in the future. And know you'll be learning it from someone who's worked in medtech for 30 years and has led teams who developed and delivered 66 medical products. I also want to thank Steve McIntyre for producing this, and I want to thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next time for part 2. That's a wrap.